So I have the honor to welcome you to the fourth working session of the conference, which will focus on the challenges of multiculturalism in Southeastern Europe and the role of monitoring. In the previous session, Professor Hoffman touched upon the topic and the challenges in getting the monitoring machinery of the Framework Convention in place. That provided us with good introduction to the topic and made my position of moderator easier. So there is no much need for me to speak on monitoring and its importance for getting insights into implementation of multicultural policies, access to minority rights, representation of ethnic minorities, etc. Instead, let me introduce our first panelist, Professor Emma Lanchner from the Center for Southeast European Studies of the University of Graz, who is also a member of the Advisory Committee of the Council of Europe Framework Convention for Protection of National Minorities. In her presentation, she's going to talk about monitoring in educational policies. So please, floor is yours.
Yes, thank you very much for the introduction, and thanks to Goran, of course, for having organized this this event. And when he first asked me to speak on a panel that will focus on Southeast Europe, I thought it's going to be a challenge because, of course, there are many people in the room who probably know better than I what I'm going to talk about. But I decided to focus on the issue of education for one particular reason that was already touched upon by Petra in her presentation. And it is the fact that we are currently working on a revision or an update of the thematic commentary on education, which was first adopted in 2006. And we all know that things have evolved since then, and our jurisprudence has also evolved. And maybe we can take this already as one opportunity for the people working on this revision. Some of them are in the room, to hear also a little bit from the audience what kind of issues you think needs to feature absolutely in such a thematic commentary on education. And yeah, I will discuss what we believe are the aims of education under the Framework Convention a bit more in general, and then try to see how they are implemented, or the role that also the monitoring played in implementing these aims of education under the Framework Convention in Southeast Europe. And then it's not only the challenge of multiculturalism that I would like to address, but I would like to address also the challenge of monitoring and follow up a little bit on our previous discussion at the end. So as I said, I would like to start fleshing out a bit the aims of education under the Framework Convention. And you might be well aware of the fact that it's Articles 12 to 14 who are the education-related provisions. But when we speak about education, of course, we have to take into consideration also the interconnections of those articles with other provisions of the Framework Convention. I would like to start with Article 4, which is the provision, as you know, on non-discrimination and equal opportunities. And indeed, one of the aims of education should be to ensure equal access to quality education for all and throughout the educational system. And here, what is, of course, in focus is the individual child that should be provided with opportunities to be trained in a way that allows this person then also to pursue other goals in life, finding employment, participating in decision-making, etc. So these are this is instrumental aim of providing quality education so that these other tools or goals could be achieved. But then, of course, it's also important to take into consideration the child's identity, and of course, also in that context, the language it speaks, and therefore also provisions in this direction should be taken. And under Article 4, it's of course also important to recall that this is a provision that encourages the states to adopt where necessary the positive measures to promote full and effective equality. And that means that coherent and consistent educational policies required, and the passive attitude in this respect may amount also to a violation. Another aim of education under the Framework Convention is, of course, then to protect minority languages and cultures. And here we already touch upon this collective dimension, which we have also in the Framework Convention, although it's primarily a convention which deals with individual rights. But of course, under Article 5, we also expect from states that they work against assimilation and they do not take any measures in this direction and also prevent this assimilation. And therefore, in this context, there is this collective dimension, and this targets mainly the protection of the minority languages and cultures. But at the same time, we also have spoken about it already. The education system should be such that it promotes bi and plurilingualism. And the last point here is another aim of education should, of course, be to promote intercultural contacts and dialogue and foster an integrated society. So this is, of course, the key message under Article 6 of the Framework Convention. We find it again, then, of course, under Article 12. And it could seem that some of those aims are also contradictory in a way, and that's why an educational policy constantly needs also to balance those different interests. And I think these three aims, as spelled out here for the educational area, reflect very well what the advisory committee has developed in its thematic commentary number 3 on language and 4 on the scope of application, what the Framework Convention aims at. So the Framework Convention aims at states providing the conditions that allow for equal access to rights and resources despite difference, to allow for the expression and acknowledgement of difference, and social interaction and inclusion across difference. So these are the three kind of goals of the Framework Convention that are, of course, also reflected as such in the educational sphere. And let's now talk about the challenges of multiculturalism in education, which is the title of the subject. But then, of course, it immediately turns out, of course, we have multicultural societies, and education does contain multicultural elements. And this addresses mostly the separate educational needs of different groups in a society, minorities and majorities. But the Framework Convention emphasizes very much, and that's also what we do in our monitoring, and we'll also do in the thematic commentary, to focus on the intercultural elements of education. And that is exactly to learn how to interact constructively with each other. And this goes for a number of areas, which I list here as well. To start with the content of education. This is mainly addressed then also in Article 12 of the Framework Convention, when it asks to foster the knowledge about each other. So about minorities learn about the majority, and the majority learns about minorities, their existence on a territory, their contribution to the culture of the state, their language, their religion. So this should all be reflected in the curricula, not only in those areas where minorities reside, but throughout the country. So the curricula are key here. Then, of course, also the educational materials that should reflect this. Besides, of course, that all sorts of stereotypes should be removed from educational materials. And when we speak about content, of course, history education is playing a central role, and we addressed it already yesterday, how important it is that multiple perspectives are given space in history education. And I would like to just reiterate what Dejan mentioned yesterday. So never celebrate a war. So I think this is also something that really is not conducive to creating integrated society. You put it even more bluntly, that this is creates a condition for new wars even. So here, this is a very important point to consider. Then, of course, the languages play a key role as one of the key features of minorities' identities. Different models exist, of course, how this can be approached. In the jurisprudence of the advisory committee, for us, it's of course important that the languages of minorities are maintained, and that minorities should be able to acquire a degree of fluency and literacy, which enables them to orally and in writing communicate in those languages, and also to pass it on to the next generation. And at the same time, and here the bi and plurilingualism comes in, of course, the learning of the state language is also important. And yeah, bi and plurilingualism is beneficial not only for minorities, but of course also for majorities. And in the jurisprudence of the advisory committee, this added value for the personal, professional development, but also, of course, for societal integration is constantly underlined. Then, of course, intercultural elements in education, so how to learn to interact constructively, which it should have a bearing also when deciding on the form or the organization of education. And we will look into this then on the case of Southeast Europe or Southeast European countries, how schools can be organized in order to achieve those goals. Teacher training is key. Of course, we mentioned history education, how important this is. So teachers of history, but not only, should be trained to teach critical thinking, allow this multi-perspectivity, should also enable them to address sensitive and emotional and controversial matters in the classroom. And of course, they should be prepared to work in a multilingual and multicultural environment. And last but not least, the role of kin states, which we addressed already yesterday and partly also today. So, of course, kin states can have, no matter you call them neighboring states, interested states, kin states, they can play a positive role as long as they move within the framework of good neighborly relations and other international principles as they are laid out also by the Bolzano recommendation. So it can be supportive, it can be also sometimes supportive in the short or medium term, but of course in the long term, it is the home state that is responsible for the education of minorities. And what we constantly say is that this cannot be outsourced. Education cannot be outsourced to another state. But of course, kin states can also play controversial and roles and contribute to tensions, in particular when it comes to textbooks or supporting parallel systems. And we are going to see this also in the context of Southeast European countries. So let's now turn to see how these three aims of education that I fleshed out in the first slide play out in the Southeast European context. And when it comes to the first area, when I spoke about equal access to quality education, I would like to briefly focus a bit on the situation of Roma children. As you all know, this segregation is a phenomenon not only in Southeast Europe. We encounter this, of course, in many other countries as well. But looking now a bit more closely at Southeast European countries, it's interesting to note that legally speaking, segregation is forbidden in most countries. But then we, of course, have to look into what the laws exactly say and how they define segregation. And I think, Antonia, yeah, I know why you're laughing, because the Croatian system defines segregation as a forced and systematic separation of persons. So it implies that there must be a state action targeting or really planning for this segregation. And it does not take account of the fact that segregation is very often not a de jure segregation, but a de facto situation. So when non-Roma parents would withdraw their children from the school, or when Roma parents voluntarily decide to send their children to specific schools because they feel that this is a safe space for them, or in most of the cases, it's of course a consequence of residential segregation. And like the example I would like to make here is the one from North Macedonia, where there are such situations, of course, as well. And again, like one particular school that I also visited during my country visit there, it was clear that it was not a forced act of putting those children in the school, but it was simply the fact, and it was also portrayed like this by the authorities, that this is the consequence of the Roma families' desire to settle in common neighborhoods, and that non-Roma parents withdraw their children from those schools. And it was indeed also a case that has been addressed by the European Court of Human Rights, which laid down a judgment in only recently in the Almasova case, where the court indeed clarified that the state have a positive obligation to implement desegregation measures that will ensure the end of segregation. What comes along, of course, here with this segregated education is situation that leads to lower educational outcomes, reduced opportunities in adulthood, perpetuation of stigma and exclusion, and this needs to be proactively addressed as a matter of priority. That was also the assessment of the advisory committee. So here, the court and the committee were, yes, so we're going along the same lines, and we're also like strengthening each other's. So here the segregation has more this dimension of discrimination, but segregation can also have this dimension of problems with integration. And the example of Bosnia, which I would like to come back to later, will show this. Then, of course, connected to segregated education, but not only, Roma pupils are also faced with issues like absenteeism, dropouts, lower educational outcomes. And I would like to recall a few measures that are taken by Southeast European countries to counter these problems. Again, in North Macedonia, education allowances are paid, but on the other hand, they might be withdrawn if a pupil has to repeat a class, so it does not always reach those in need. In some schools, free school meals are provided also to counter absenteeism. And a very interesting situation we know from Albania, where this was then seen as a pull factor for Roma pupils in specific schools that actually seem to have led to segregation. And that was the situation also in another court judgment in X versus Albania. And as one of the first measures that the Albanian authorities have taken in order to end segregation on the basis of this pull factor was to cancel their school meals.
Instead of providing universal school meals.
Yes, that would have been another possibility, of course. So, yeah, and then another problem is, of course, lower outcomes also in terms of the level of education Roma children would reach, sometimes not beyond primary education. And Kosovo has tried to counter this by providing scholarships for secondary education. And here we have again the problem that this is not possible for Roma pupils that graduate from the SERP parallel system, so they cannot access this possibility of having scholarships for secondary education. So we see that sometimes there are measures that are set in place, but at the same time, the implementation also encounters some difficulties. And then what we also look into, not only Southeast European countries, but other countries as well, is of course also gender biased outcomes for Roma girls. Here, of course, we need to rely on disaggregated data that very often are not available. But when they are available, then we observe lower attendance rate for girls, especially in secondary education or also rural areas. And then, of course, also the implications of early marriage on education of girls. And here, it's very often also the authorities who claim this is part of their tradition and their culture, and what we then normally would call the authorities Two is also to look into the socioeconomic factors that lead to early marriages in order to address this situation. Then the second point was like the aim of education should be to maintain minority languages and at the same time promote bi and multi or plurilingualism. Like looking into Southeast European countries, I would like to go through these different possibilities on how these aims can be achieved or how the states are organizing their education in order to achieve this. So the first possibility is, of course, to provide instruction in minority language. So basically monolingual minority language schools with the learning of the state language of the subject. And we find this in all the Southeast European countries, not for all the minorities, but mainly for the larger ones, but also in some occasions for smaller communities. And the problems that we see there is, of course, sometimes the lack of textbooks and the availability of teachers. Sometimes, especially in secondary education, pupils have to commute further away in order to have access to schools at secondary level. And then the question is, of course, how do such systems contribute to also learning the state language well enough? And yeah, I was just happy to have a quick chat with our moderator before, because in Serbia, according to the findings of the advisory committee, this learning of the state language for 2 units per week for 45 minutes is apparently not enough in order to master the state language at a level which would allow also entering higher education institutions. So many of those pupils would then seek also for moving abroad to continue their studies. In Macedonia, children enrolled in the Albanian schools start learning the Macedonian language only from the 4th grade on, and also for just a limited amount of hours. And in my view, the least satisfactory solution has been found in Kosovo, where the learning of the other co-official language is not even foreseen in the legal system. So that means Serb students would not learn Albanian, and Albanian students would not learn the Serbian language. So this is, I think, quite problematic. And when the system of learning the minority language as a subject is chosen, like education in the state language, but then a subject of minority language, it comes along most often also with additional elements of culture and history of this minority as such. And here the problems that we face are that they are often electives or they're organized outside the educational, the regular curriculum. The amount of hours is also very limited. It's sometimes only for 1 or 2 hours, which we think is not sufficient in order to really make sure that the minority language can be really maintained at a high level of proficiency also in writing. Also the problem with textbooks, overall it seemed to have improved over the monitoring cycles, but some textbooks are still lacking, and also the lack of teachers is problematic. And the last possibility how to go about this issue would, of course, to offer bilingual models. We do have foreseen them in law in some of the countries. Croatia, for instance, has foreseen this model as one of the possibilities that can be chosen, but it's, as far as I know, also in Serbia, but it's rarely used in practice. So minorities that have the possibility would rather choose the possibility to have full education in their language. And like talking also to minorities that do have this possibility to have a full instruction in minority language are very reluctant to accept a change to a bilingual model out of fear also of losing their minority language. And so it's having said that, I do not want to appear to discredit the value of instruction in the mother tongue. So this has, of course, its value, but at the same time, the other aims should also be kept in mind. And this is basically the other aims are learning also the state language, which is also needed in order to make use of other language rights in like as a consequence. It's difficult to imagine a bilingual administration or to implement other language rights if the school system does not train a population that is proficient in both languages. So this has to be kept in mind as well. And then, of course, also communities are drifting apart, not only linguistically, but also socially. And the educational institutions are not perceived as a common social space. Which brings me to my last point. So education should foster contact, dialogue, and integrated society. And the examples I would like to touch upon, you see them here. Of course, with the Kosovo parallel SERP system, which is still in place, this is very problematic, in particular in light of the fact that no systematic initiatives are taken by the authorities to make it possible for pupils of those schools to meet maybe even outside the curriculum. Sometimes they are, the two schools exist also in the same facility, but also there the contacts are basically very, very limited. Such extracurricular activities, if they exist, are rather like funded by civil society organizations or international donors. And as I mentioned before, so this not learning the other language is of course very problematic, not only from the point of view of integration of society, but also for the employment perspectives of pupils of from both groups. Here we have a number of other problems, like the recognition of school leaving diplomas. As I mentioned before, this does not allow Serbs or other pupils graduating from these schools to access scholarships or to continue in higher education institutions in Kosovo. And this, of course, like these parallel systems, this perpetuates a division between communities and generates or raises a generation that views the other with suspicion and resentment. So here, of course, we do have a big problem. And the other example that I would like to mention is Bosnia, as Petra mentioned. So this is, we are here about speaking about the two schools under one roof issue, which is, of course, targeting the constituent peoples. And we address this under Article 6. So under this article, which is about contact and dialogue between the different groups. And here again, so that mainly these different history curricula that are still taught, they don't foster this critical thinking, they don't promote empathy for the other group. The own group is mostly depicted as the sole victim of the past conflict, and the others mostly or nearly exclusively as the perpetrator. And this, of course, is also undermining the integration of society as a whole. In Macedonia, there has been the attempt by this the strategy One Society for All that has been adopted by the government a couple of years ago. I think now we are already in the second round of this strategy, and it will be interesting to hear from Rubin how things are going. But yeah, so this was kind of an attempt to like make the education system more inclusive. What we observed during the monitoring was that this has remained a kind of an elite project a little bit. It did not really reach the professionals on the ground. So the teachers and directors in the schools, they were not really part of the whole process. And that like resulted in a situation where intercultural educational approaches in the schools in Macedonia remain rather the exception than the rule, and much more effort needs to be put into this. So let me come to an end here with my last slide. So yeah, so plurilingual and intercultural education remains a challenge in Europe overall, in all Council of Europe states, or in the state parties to the Framework Convention that we look into, but also in Southeast Europe. Despite some progress made, I mentioned some of the positive measures that have been taken. Other measures would include also the provision of teaching assistants or mediators, but very often only in very precarious working conditions. Legislation has improved, the textbook situation has improved, but still not the level that would be really satisfactory. And what is the role of monitoring in all this? I think it is important that the monitoring does keep the attention of the authorities high, does keep it on the agenda. Of course, also it is more on the agenda if there is also a follow-up where they also need to look into this. I think the monitoring is also important, and we have heard that during our during the reception that also NGOs and civil society organizations, they do use the opinions of the advisory committee when they try to have their dialogue with the authorities. They use the findings of the advisory committee and the recommendations of the advisory committee in their negotiations with the authorities. So I think this is a very important element that we always have to keep in mind, even if we do not witness always the progress that we would like to see. Another challenge in the monitoring, I think, has been touched upon also in the previous panel, is the level of detail of the recommendations. So on the one hand, states might wish for detailed guidelines or guidance on how they should improve the situation, but at the same time, we as an advisory committee are not the ones to tell them how to do it. And yeah, we would also not run into the risk of being accused of micromanaging the situation. So it should really be on the states to see what fits their situation best. And I think really those follow-ups could be a useful platform where then practical examples can be provided, but it still remains then, of course, with the state authorities to see what fits their situation best. I think another challenge in the monitoring is, especially about this education area, is a little bit also in the composition of the advisory committee. Sometimes we do have sociolinguists, we do have educational scientists. In other times, we might not have them in the composition. So, of course, here also these multiple disciplines present in the advisory committee would be very beneficial also for us to really have a good understanding of the situation, to have a good understanding of what the latest research about specific issues is, in particular, for instance, when it comes to bilingual education, the different formats in which this can come about. It would be very useful to draw more also on the work of other disciplines. And in this respect, it's of course for us also important to draw from the research that is carried out in the countries themselves. So research like Marco is carrying out on the educational outcomes also of minorities in Serbia will be very helpful for the advisory committee to draw upon. And my last point is on synergies with other actors. Petra mentioned that sometimes we might not concur, but most of the times we do concur, and that of course strengthens also the message that we convey to the states. I mentioned the European Court of Human Rights judgments, Committee of Ministers resolutions, and I'm not speaking about the resolution they draft then on a specific country, but they have, for instance, this very important recommendation on the importance of plurilingualism and intercultural education also for democratic culture. So these are also recommendations that can provide guidance to the states, then more on the details. I mentioned here also the Parliamentary Assembly. I think it's an important new development. As you know, Kosovo is applying for membership in the Council of Europe, and the Parliamentary Assembly has engaged two eminent lawyers to look into the conformity of the Kosovo legal system with the Council of Europe standards. And this report has been released only a couple of days ago. And these two experts, they do draw a lot also from our fifth cycle opinion on Kosovo, and basically their conclusion is that Kosovo's legal system is generally in accordance with Council of Europe standards, but they do also make a couple of recommendations on what they still could improve. And we find a number of advisory committee opinions also in this document. And one of them is calling for concrete strategies for intercommunity dialogue, in particular in education. So they do also focus very much on this area. And also the EU Commission in its reports draws on our findings. And I think if all those actors also work together, we do see a positive development. But I think that my last comment, and I would like to pay tribute to the really work on the ground that is carried out by civil society organizations. And I think this is also for us in the committee so important to have these contacts during our visits when we come to the country, but also written submissions that we receive from civil society organizations. They really help us to understand the situation better, and we hope that we can give something back by our findings, our assessment, and our recommendations that they then on their side can use in their daily work. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Manchner, for your interesting presentation and valuable insights. Now, let me introduce our next panelist, Professor Antonia Petricusic, from the Department of Sociology, Faculty of Law of the University of Zagreb. In her presentation, she's going to focus on gender perspective and equality.
Do translators hear me now? You do. I don't think that anyone is actually needing your service. So I think you could get some rest because I don't see anyone with headphones on. So if Mr. Director, who is just right now putting the headphones on, is fine with that. Gorane, are you fine with that? So we don't stress them with translation. Okay. Then we have to go on. I just wanted to be fair towards you. Okay, I'll stand up because Marta has also announced that she is wishing to stand up during her presentation because I want to be noticed and heard, because the topic I'm presenting today is not a topic that everyone is generally interested in, because it's the topic that concerns just half of us being here. And that's the topic of gender equality or promotion of gender equality in the work of the advisory committee. I hope Goran, whom I have not complimented, even though I wish to do so, and I'm doing that right now, and his team who gathered us here, has asked me to focus on Southeastern European countries in the monitoring of the advisory committee, reading the opinions and also the advisory committee recommendations. I realized it makes no sense to focus on Southeast European countries with respect to promotion of gender equality in the work of the advisory committee, because that target is still very poorly met. So I should better give a general outlook how the advisory committee has throughout the time improved its focus and interest for the promotion of gender equality. Before I start, so I'm still on the first or zero slide, I would like to share my joy with the fact that Framework Convention has become conceptualized as a living instrument. In the same way, the European Convention for Human Rights and Fundamental Freedoms has been treated by the European Court of Human Rights. And this fact, this achievement, is a result of work of men and women that were and are members of the advisory committee, who are brave enough to conceptualize the instrument of law as something that has to fit current societal circumstances and take into consideration societal change that is constant and is inevitable. It was great to hear from Petra that in the 6th monitoring cycle that is just about to begin or has begun, the new approach has been devised, and the constant efforts to bring the convention closer both to the authorities and to the persons belonging to national minorities is taking place. I'm telling you this because I'm also seeing this change with regard to promotion of gender equality. So the first one, okay, here. The issue of gender mainstreaming is an approach that has been undertaken or decided by the international organizations for 25 years already. I remember being a PhD student and a collaborator of Professor Josef Marko, who is my and Emma's academic father. Can I say that? Him being back in early 2000s member of the advisory committee and telling us about gender mainstreaming back then. But that approach, and you can see what it is, here is the definition that was put forward in 1997, you see, really long time ago, by the ECOSOC, UN expert body overseeing implementation of Covenant on Economic and Social and Cultural Rights. That approach has been steadily, although in a shy manner, introduced also by the Council of Europe for quite some time. But that approach has not been visible in the opinions of the advisory committee for quite long and up until recently. So that approach should be integrated in policy making, in the implementation of legislation and public policies at all stages of public policy making and implementation. There is another concept that has also taken some time to become mainstreamized, if I can say so, into the international law vocabulary. And this is the concept of intersectionality that has been brought by American Black feminists more than almost 30 years ago. But it took a long time for it to penetrate into, first of all, legal terminology and particularly international law sphere, mostly in relation to promotion of gender equality. Intersectional discrimination is a multiple discrimination that disproportionately hits marginalized group because they have several traits that are exposing them to discriminatory treatments of either state institutions or other citizens in a country. Women from national minorities being both societal group women and national minorities, some of them with disabilities, some of them belonging to sexual minorities, some of them living in deprived, economically and socially deprived areas, lacking education, they're more prone to intersectional discrimination. This morning, Professor Rainer Hoffmann was mentioning something along this line, but not using the same vocabulary. He sticked, I will dare to say, to the old vocabulary of double or multiple discrimination. I can assure you, having this firsthand experience, when within the advisory committee, we were just trying to copy-paste the strategic approach put forward by the Council of Europe Gender Equality Strategy, the current one, that should have become reflected in the working document on the advisory committee for the promotion of gender equality in the work of advisory committee, how much hindrances and misunderstanding from the side of our male colleagues were demonstrated, who were claiming, why would we need this concept of intersectionality or the one of intersectional discrimination when there is already on the table the concept of multiple discrimination that all of us have already acquired and are familiar with. So why to bother with something new that is anyhow feminist and fashionable, and we don't actually need it. So if you come across the, what is this, pushbacks or lack of understanding from the men who are experts in human rights, moreover in minority rights, you understand such a challenge is to make a value shift in the minds of those who have to acquire concepts that have been recognized by empirical studies and academic papers, but take some time to get translated into policy level, particularly of international human rights organizations. Okay, this is the slide that the mostly deals with Southeast European countries, but this what's on this slide can definitely be copy-pasted in any other national environment. The equality of sexes or gender equality is something that has not been achieved. All indicators, measuring, studies are confirming that. Women are underrepresented in the positions of power. They're very often excluded even from equality in property and like ownership. They face discrimination in assessing good quality education or achieving some kind of educational goals. Moreover, in all societies, they face sexual harassment and gender-based violence. Again, a term that is to majority of people quite novel in the human rights agenda. And the understanding that gender-based violence is violation of human rights because it's a violation of women's rights is something that has not been fully accepted in the hearts of even human rights, I would not say activists, but human rights lawyers. So whatever I mentioned applies to Southeast European countries, all of them, including Slovenia to Kosovo in the most southern part of the region, or it's Macedonia. What complicates this picture is that very often there are no data that follow the gender inequality within minority communities. And what I was able to conclude by reading opinions and also state reports, that there is this predominant insistence of the advisory committee to deal with Roma women. Even Emma's presentation underlined that, because majority of educational human rights violations that have been acknowledged by the advisory committee are with respect to Roma. That does not mean that they don't deserve this attention. But my opinion is that women or children from other national minority communities also deserve a focus in the opinions of the advisory committee, because that provides tool to their leaders, to leaders of their communities, to advocate for the improvements of their rights in respective countries. And finally, within minority communities, for quite long time, because men were mostly in the positions of power, let us not fool ourselves, the issue of gender equality was non-topic. Only recently, I am noticing, as a social scientist that is both lawyer and sociologist and teaching minority rights and women's rights, the emerging interest of national minorities themselves, not only Roma, but also other national minority communities. Even FUEN, you know, the Federation of European Nationalities, has started this or last year a project that is encompassing all its members on women from national minorities, trying at the same time to empower them, sometimes on a very superficial and naive way, believing that providing women around the table where decisions are made, it's enough, but has initiated a project as a bottom-up perspective that is bringing in together members from various states of Europe that are FUEN members, that are discussing in which way issue of women participation, of realization of their rights can be and should be empowered within minority communities. They invited me to a session they had maybe 2-3 weeks ago in Vienna, and I said, maybe the way to improve that is to have gender equality plans within every single minority organization, or to have this gender mainstreaming in national minority policies that should be then pushed for by the states, not only by, or implemented by the states, not national minority organizations. So they're based. And what is promising is the fact that national minority organizations themselves have become aware of it, and they're advocating for change. I will also share one of my wildest dreams, that I instructed one of the ladies who is on the top of FUEN's managerial structure. I told her, listen, you're meeting the current High Commissioner of National Minorities soon at some gathering. Why don't you tell him, we as FUEN are ready to help you write a new set of recommendations on gender equality in minority communities. This is how you start creating a new standard. Petra is doing this. I'm just wondering what this means. So there are ways, and the awakening, or this bottom-up approach that is happening spontaneously with, you will see soon, with growing understanding of the advisory committee that gender dimension of minority policy deserves not only attention, but commitment, is assuring me that the change is around the corner and that is palpable, and that is going to happen. In which way the Council of Europe, like overall, is contributing to this change? It has agreed upon and accepted and made I cannot say legally binding, but politically binding. The two gender equality strategies, one is expiring this year. So there will be, there is not yet one for the 2024 to 2028, but there will be one. I'm sure they're not giving up. Once you establish a track, it's difficult to go back. That's the lucky thing about fighting for women's rights, with some exceptions, of course. So those strategies have formed the base for the change in the structural approach of the advisory committee towards gender equality. If there were no such strategies, there would be no gender equality checklist. Okay, this is about the court. I will skip this because I talk too much. You can ask me later about it. Okay, and there is also ECRI is dealing with gender equality in a way, talking about intersectional discrimination. European Court of Human Rights is also acknowledging this shift and so on. But what is most rewarding and promising, and Petra, please lift your view, it's the aspect of the change that I've been witnessing as a member of the advisory committee from 2018 to 2022. And you know, there is a saying, cherchez la femme. You know that saying, everyone knows it. I had no idea it has origin in detective novels in which there would usually be a female suspect, somebody who is emotionally unstable, who would be blamed or at least suspected for a crime that had been committed. But in this case, those femmes or femmes, tell me in French how it's plural, femme, are Petra and Elise. Particularly Elise, who came to the position of the head of the department. I don't know what exactly the structure it's called, but once Elise landed, the change started because she had different perspective. She wore skirt, maybe not literally, but she knew what being a woman implied in everyday life and brought this gender perspective to the table of the advisory committee and said, let us revise the gender equality checklist that existed previously based on the gender equality strategy from 2017. And then Petra, who used to be a president, Marie as well, of course, but here I have, Marie, sorry, I did not want to be impolite, but Marie convinced me to accept the position of gender equality rapporteur, even though I said, you know, I cannot take that on board too, because I have 2 children and single mother and all that. And then she said, you can. Thank you, Marie. And this is one of the quotes that I found on the web page of the advisory committee, in which this intersectional approach, the one that acknowledges that women from minority communities are very prone to discrimination just because they are both women and minorities, and if there's something else even more likely, has been demonstrated firmly in a way that gender equality is becoming more and more integrated in the reports. The good thing is that there are so far 2 gender equality checklists. That's informal document that serves the team of experts who are visiting, who are doing country visits, to also pay attention to gender dimension of minority policies they're overviewing or inspecting. I have to be honest and tell there are usually so many other politically related questions, security, stability, and so on, that those issues do not come to the focus of the working group. I also regret that this is the first gender equality checklist. You will see only several, Emma mentioned some of those articles have been involved. And then in the second gender equality checklist from 2021, we also expanded articles to additional one because the advisory committee interpreting the Framework Convention as a living instrument, so potential in other articles of the conventions to relate them to the promotion of gender equality. What is also good is that in one of the opinions on Italy, while I was still a gender equality rapporteur, we even pushed for reproductive and sexual rights of women coming from national or being members of national minorities, because one national minority group, I believe those were even Croats in the eastern part of Italy, are denied the service of reproductive care because there are no gynecologists in a normal, shall I say, even though normal is a wrong term, like in decent vicinity to which they could turn for a service, gynecological service, and particularly abortion. So things are changing. They're changing too slowly. My idea or suggestion is that gender equality checklist should not be a hidden document for public, but also something that is made public also to empower activists to know what to ask for from minority communities, the authorities, because there is a growing number of empowered feminist women from minority communities who are simply willing to argue, to advocate for a change within their own societies. I'm sure that my colleagues from Croatia are even able to confirm this statement of mine by observing how the minority scene is changing and how actually this is the momentum in which insisting on minority rights or on women's rights of minority women is the time when we can achieve more than ever before. And I'm sure that I also have some conclusions. I usually try to remain positive or optimistic at the end. Hopefully I was not pessimistic in those conclusions. I will see what is here. Yeah. So women's rights, of course, cannot be promoted sufficiently by the work of advisory committee, but advisory committee can be a substitute mechanism that is reinforcing other international women's human rights mechanisms, such as UN Declaration on the Elimination of all forms of discrimination towards women, such as Council of Europe's Istanbul Convention that targets elimination of sexual harassment and gender-based violence, and many other general recommendations of CERT, this UN body, expert bodies for the promotion of gender equality. By interpreting the provisions of the Framework Convention as living instrument, we are able also to empower women from minority communities. Again, I'm underlining not solely focusing on the most vulnerable ones within minority communities, and those are Roma women, but we are also responsible to give a voice and power and strength to women from other national minorities, because with our help, and in this sense, I consider us advisory committee, they can also be empowered to ask for the change, empowerment, recognition of their rights, to the authorities in their own countries, and also to the structures of governing organizations of their national minorities. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Antonia, for your important observations on gender issues in minority rights and minority policies. And our final panelist for the session is our dear colleague, Marta Sjanicic, Principal Research Fellow and Head of Center for Legal Research here at our institute. In her presentation, she's going to focus on challenges that are coming in the implementation of monitoring instruments that our institute developed for the tracking of enrollment inclusion policies. Marta, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Would you like to continue? No, I'm fine. Thank you, Marco, for the announcement. Having in mind all previous presentations, I think that we could now switch a bit from international to national regulations and to challenges of multiculturalism in Serbia and the role of monitoring on Roma example. So I will speak in English, and for domestic language literate, we have also a presentation in Serbian. Roma in Serbia, Serbia has acknowledged the status of national minority through the law 2002. It's the law on the protection of rights and freedoms of national minorities, and through the mature democratic cultures maturity of democratic cultures in Serbia, but also a liberal attitude of the European states and institutions. The situation contributed to the, let's say, nominal acknowledgement of status of Roma population in Serbia. Yesterday I was thinking, and then I added this nominal because it was really nominal, having in mind the implementation. Actually, being a lawyer in Serbia, I can say that we are a bit, if I can say so, over-normed. I mean, we have a flood of regulations. Sometimes they have their bases, sometimes they are overlapping, and sometimes we have gaps. Having all these regulations, still we have gaps which are not covered. Being overnormed is not so bad sometimes, but what is bad is not having implementation of this norming or over-norming. So from 2009, Serbia started to develop, let's say, planned development and solution of these problems through different strategies related to Roma population. And strategies are also, as everywhere, I assume they are acts which encompass planning. They're not followed by any sanction as laws, any penalty, but they plan, and they have also different measures to action plans to implement the plans that are developed. So the first strategy was enacted in 2009 till 2014. There was 13 fields of intervention. Second was enacted in 2016 and should last till 2025. And the third, it's called more or less revision of the strategy from 2016, but let's call it third strategy, which was enacted in 2022, quite recently, with the duration until 2030. The second one from 2016 merged or lowered, reduced the fields of intervention into 5 main fields: education, health, employment, social care, and stanovanje, housing. Yes. And the last one involved also explicitly fight against discrimination. Okay. The first strategy from 2019 was actually the focus of the whole presentation is what from the first panel, Ljubica posed the question of evidence-based monitoring and evidence-based actions. So the focus of presentation is actually evidence-based monitoring. So first strategy from 2009 was really prepared on some evidences, and these evidences was drawn from the research of the Center for Research of Ethnicity, It is research which was published through the possibilities of social integrations of Roma in Serbia from 2001. But other strategies from 2016 and 2020 were adopted without valid data as the basis. So that means that for every next document, there were not the evaluation of the previous strategic document was not conducted. During this period, it was like assessment from institute, but also from, let's say, NGO sector, and so some kind of joint assessment. The position of Roma was improved, but the problem is that we cannot assess how much this improvement, how actually what kind of the improvement it was visible, visible, but we cannot measure it. So our ombudsman pointed this out in 2013 in the report to the National Assembly on the conduction of the implementation of the strategy from 2009, and but the ombudsman did not appoint it just on the basis of nothing, but conducted independent research on the sample of 200 Roma 200 Roma, and combined it with its own data, and the data were collected from the complaints of the citizens, which were sent to the ombudsman. So the conclusion was drawn that the success in education of Roma was achieved partially, but in the other areas it was not achieved. And we can just go to the previous slide, which says that the strategy from 2009 had 13 fields of intervention. So just one field of intervention was covered partially. Strategy from 2016 was focused on 5 strategic goals and 29 operative, so lower level goals, and 210 measures. Very practical measures to implement strategic goals and operational goals. The strategy was written under quite of time pressure, since Serbia was and is always on this path, European path. So the validity of data, or also existence of data, is very disputable for the enactment of this strategy. And one of the key strategic activities was to create mechanism for managing of strategy, but this mechanism should involve Roma population in it. And the second strategic activity was to evaluate the strategy year after its adoption. It was not, both of the key strategic activities were not implemented. In 2022, the third strategy was enacted without measuring effectiveness of the previous strategy, and the data which were used as a basis are some administrative data, and let's say quite inaccurate and somehow inaccurate data, let's say, which were collected in local municipalities on the basis of no common mechanism. They were collected on an ad hoc basis. So this is not quite a state of affairs that we would like as a result. So Institute of Social Sciences had several activities to improve the situation. And in 2016, the project development of methodology for monitoring of institutional improvement of Roma status was initiated, and it was done with the cooperation of network of Roma Association of Citizens, Krug Liga Roma, and the research was actually a pilot research, which encompassed about 30,000 Roma and Roma women, men and women, which makes about 10% of total Roma population in Serbia. They were quite well allocated around Serbia. You can see 10 local municipality units and two city municipalities. The result of the pilot research was that in the first year of implementation of strategy from the second, let's say, strategy, 2016, the strategy was not implemented. The programs which should improve the position of Roma, they are created on central level and in international organizations, which must not be bad, which should be good, but without data and without efficient involvement of Roma population in these processes, and that the strategy or measures for implementation of strategy do not give the minimum of wished results. In 2019, second, let's say, activity that the Institute undertook was that it, together with GIZ, German Organization for International Cooperation, but for the needs of coordination body of government of the Republic of Serbia. So together with the coordination body, not on its own initiative, conducted the analysis of conducting and managing of strategy of social inclusion of Roma men and women for the period 1625. So the objectives of the strategy was to assess the situation for realization related to implementation of the strategy, meaning the way of monitoring of strategy, reporting on the results of implementation of strategy, collecting of data, a second way of coordination of activities and intersectoral cooperation between local level and Republic of Serbia bodies, so horizontally, vertically, intersectoral and inter-body cooperation, and also to assess the level of participation and influence of Roma community to the implementation of strategy. The report, the project was based on the analysis of the reports of state bodies and of state bodies. Second, the qualitative methods were used, like focus groups, individual interviews, and the third, data were gathered. Data from a regional cooperation council, data from a Republic's Institute for Statistics, and data which are collected in the reports of state bodies from state bodies in local municipalities related to the state status of Roma. Also, what is quite connected with the previous presentation, and which is quite important part of the assessment of the strategy, the research between Roma women population on their, let's say, impression of their influence on realization of strategy and effects of strategy were collected. And they were also invited to propose and recommend how to achieve more effective implementation of the strategy. They had quite number of questions. They were responding how Roma women organizations influence on implementation of strategy, their experiences related to the collection of data on implementation of strategic measures and so on. About 127 Roma women were involved through 10 organizations of civil society in 7 local municipalities. Qualitative methods, for example, 14 individual interviews were conducted with ministries or other bodies in the state, with the ombudsman, with the Vojvodina ombudsman, with the regional council for cooperation. There were 11 focus groups with over 200 participants. So it was quite detailed research involving the participants from all spheres: Roma population, local municipalities, state. And the results of the research, of the research assessing second strategy from 2016 pointed to several conclusions: that the strategy is not implemented, that the measures that were undertaken on an ad hoc basis, they were badly planned, they don't have strategic influence, and that there is no efficient way to manage strategy, and that there are no data on the implementation of the strategy, and especially that the Roma population is not involved in its implementation. So all these conclusions were sent with the recommendations to the coordination body and of course the government of Republic of Serbia, with the recommendations to set the methodology of monitoring of measures of social inclusions of Roma based on a human rights-based approach. And with the so just in short, methodology that were developed by Institute of Social Sciences. It was not just proposal that it should be monitored, but the Institute of Social Sciences developed methodology, and methodology. The point that methodology was developed in 2020. It was focused on these 5 areas: education, housing, employment, health, and social care. And what was very important is that the software for monitoring of measures was developed. It was developed for 1.5 to 2 years. The software should have been used by the coordination body with the Minister of for Human Rights and Minority Rights as a executor, let's say, of the software, as a manager of the software, and every measure. If we get back to some of the previous slides, there were 210 measures that should have been followed. So we developed the way of monitoring of every of 210 measures. And what is very important is that there is not just a software, but also the people in local municipalities, employers in local municipalities were nominated. They had their code to enter the software and so on. So the whole structure was developed for using this software. It is just an example. Since I'm a lawyer in healthcare, I just gave some example how some indicators related to healthcare should have been followed. These are bodies that are competent for implementing some of the measures. And for example, Dom Zdravlja, on primary healthcare center, one of the measures is to promote public health programs related to all Roma men and women on territory of Republic of Serbia. So it is one of the 200 measures. So we developed like questions, do you, in last 1 year, do you organize and so on. We developed indicator. And for example, when it comes to vulnerable subgroups of Roma men and women, we have also like a list which program they developed. So it's going quite to the details. Or for example, when it comes to Ministry of Education, also what a measure is to define appropriate program of education for working place for mediators. So what did you do? The question is, what did you do in the last 1 year to introduce appropriate program of education into the education system for mediators? If you did something, then please attach the decision, the whatever law or something like that. So as a conclusion, on the basis of such an analysis, everybody in state body could make an ex post analysis of the previous strategy in order to make a good basis for the next strategy. Not just quantitative data, also qualitative data. So here the coordination body would have this task, coordination body for Roma issues. However, this was not done. The software was not implemented. The new strategy enacted in 2022 was adopted without relevant data, and on the basis of data, without data as the basis, or on the basis of incorrect data. So software stands there. It's the ownership of this and Ministry for Human Rights, but it's not in function still. It's fully developed. It's not in function. So we are still, let's say, we are still status quo on the when it comes to evidence-based policy related to Roma population. Unfortunately, it sounds negative, as Antonia said. I don't want to sound negative, but seems that I have to now. Thank you.
Thank you, Marta. Since our panel started a bit late, we should have only no. Actually, lunch is catering is getting cold, but we should give space for several brief questions. Peter, please.
First, I would like to thank you for your presentations. Very good and useful whole presentation. But I would like to reflect what actually to the last, especially the last presentation of Marta Sjeničić. I completely agree that actually, and I would just emphasize how actually the monitoring system is crucial for the implementation of any documents. And currently, we are in Serbia developing also the action plan for national minorities. And if you look the previous action plan for the rights of national minorities, we can see the lack of indicators and clear system of monitoring. Related to the Roma issues, as we could see from the analysis, last 20 years, we had strategies and many measures, hundreds of measures without real implementation. In 2009, when I worked in the ministry, when I resigned from the Ministry for Human Minority Rights, I publicly resigned with the message that actually that monitoring system is not established, that we had a misuse of funds. The problem with the misuse of funds, if we have clear established action plan with the system of monitoring with indicators, misuse of funds will be visible. And I think that what we need, we have now this, for example, from the Institute for Social Sciences now developed. I think it's important at this moment to have stronger political message, political pressure. Council of Europe has a soft power. And I think this should be prioritized, this issue of the monitoring, not to have just action plan for national minorities, action plan for the Roma issues. I think we should now focus on the monitoring. Without this action plan for national minorities is, or which we have now strategy for Roma, would be again another paper.
There was another question here. Yeah?
Likewise, thank you for three very interesting presentations. I had two questions, one for Emma and one for Antonia. So, Emma, your presentation got me thinking a lot about education and just brought back some reflections and issues that I thought about for the last 15 years. At some point you mentioned bilingual education, or bilingual model, I think it was called. My question to you was, where does that model come from? Is that the Dutch model? Is that the sort of model aimed for the Danish minority in Germany, a model from South Tyrol? And how affordable it is for states in Eastern Europe to have such a model in place. And I'm thinking now of Romania, who has been criticized for almost 10 years for its substandard education in the Romanian language. So how could they afford to, or why would they, or where would they have the money to, invest more in improving the education system and make it more inclusive also for minorities? And Antonia, I think it was about time that gender equality mainstreamed, and I very much welcome, and I'm just very happy to hear that it's there, it's being discussed. And but it has come 15 years after the first critiques were raised in the literature that multiculturalism has hijacked the equality agenda, etc. Now, I just wanted to make a comment and also ask a question. So my comment is that gender equality is shouldn't concern just women alone. It is about the group's cohesiveness and its identity in the end. Now, my question to you is if gender mainstreaming is enough. How about sexual minorities? How about hybridity within minorities? So we're having more and more members that come from mixed families. So how do we respond to them? So that's it. Thank you.
Ruben, please.
Okay, thank you. Because Emma told me to give some follow-ups about the strategy. For one society, interculturalism, not for all. For all, it's popular gospel or something. The strategy actually finished in February this year, but now we have follow-up, and we finished the process of the evaluation and drafting a new strategy. Anna, was not here, also Anna was in the team of experts, me, Anna, and two other guys that we made the new follow-up. And I think now it's this month will be approved by the government, and from February we start the new strategy. But now the name will be for interculturalism, social cohesion. It's not anymore for roles. And about the education, so because the focus was much more in primary education, now we will extend it to the secondary education also, and the aims will be securing the interaction between the pupils and from the different communities on different languages in the primary, secondary school, then fostering of the learning of the language of the others, because that is one of the problems that also you in advisory committee report mentioned it as a recommendation also, and now we have some measures to learn the language of the others, and also the fostering of the elements of interculturality in curricula. So this will be the new aims of the strategy for interculturalism and social cohesion in the following 3 years. Yes, thank you.
Sorry, Andrea, this is answer to you. And I think it's going to be a quite short one. So gender equality mainstreaming and as conceptual as today in international human rights organization requires explicit extension to both women and men and also diverse gender identities. So it's not that by promoting women's rights or empowerment, we are forgetting or leaving behind other gender minorities that exist. And it's also a shift that has happened at the level of the Council of Europe that the advisory committee is required to acknowledge and take into account. I believe that extending the protection of intersectionally discriminated members of the groups that are not merely national minorities, it's in the time to come going to become more of a focus of the advisory committee, because simply the human rights law has expanded in this direction. And even though there are backlashes, groups that are advocating against recognition of rights of sexual minorities, this is still the official agenda of international organization and of multilateralism. So for the time being, I don't have fears, but you never know what can happen, because scapegoating, no, is it called scapegoating? Scapegoating of minorities, particularly sexual minorities, is an issue that easily mobilizes nowadays electorates in nationalism soaked world. So those are the first expected victims that can be targeted. And therefore the issue or the work of the expert bodies, all expert bodies of the Council of Europe, is to keep an eye on that. And maybe in those biannual reports, which the advisory committee is preparing, also underline the importance of this aspect, because in biannual reports, we make the world know what is important for the advisory committee at this very moment and how its work and interpretation of the Framework Convention has evolved.
Okay, I'll try to be brief. Well, first of all, thanks, Antonia, for this presentation before I come back to your question. But I would also like to mention that when we set up our working groups, we also try really to have both sexes represented. And we have already witnessed several times how important this is. Also, in order to really get into conversations, in particular with women of sometimes specific minority groups. So this is definitely one attempt how we try in our working methods also to have this reflected. And then I would also like to say that like women is of course one of the groups that we have or want to place a focus on, or like put them also in the center of attention, but also minority youth. Which we often tend to forget, and also to hear their voices during the monitoring and during our visits in order to have reflection also on how they perceive developments in terms of culture, education, etc. So I think that's also very important. And that brings me to your question, the bilingual model, where does it come from? I don't think that there is one particular model that we can say that's the model. I think there are so many different possibilities in organizing bilingual education. And it can be like really divided by subjects. And then I think it's not so much more expensive because then there was one teacher teaching the subject in the minority language, and you have for another subject, you have a teacher teaching it in the majority language. So you need the teachers nevertheless, no matter in which language they are teaching it. So I think it is also a matter of finding the best way in order not to make it like unaffordable. Of course, there would be models like the model of one teacher, one language, where you would have two teachers in the classroom all the time. The one addressing the pupils always in the minority language, the other in the majority language for all the subjects. And of course, this doubles basically the need of teachers.
Yeah.
Of course, that's unaffordable in certain circumstances. But there is no one model of bilingual education. And that's why I think it's also for us important to understand more and learn more from educational scientists what is the current like also state of research about the different possibilities, so that we can then also be helpful in the follow-ups maybe to speak about different possibilities that are in place or research outcome on how successfully they can also be implemented. So yeah, there is no one model that I could tell it comes from there and that would be applicable all over. So it's really to be seen, and that requires, of course, also the training of teachers respectively. And like I allow me to make also a comment on the question that was addressed to you. I found your research so interesting that you were doing, and this is such an important thing that we always point at also in our opinions, that it's not enough to have a strategy. It needs to be, first of all, designed together with those concerned, and then of course also the implementation and the outcomes need to be evaluated. So that has it had any impact? And therefore, I very much like also your point on the indicators. So how important it is to have indicators, and not only indicator on structure and processes, but in particular indicators on outcomes. And outcome in the sense of, has it really benefited the group concerned, the Roma, or in the action plan of national minorities? And that requires then, of course, like a structured monitoring. And it's great the work you do, and it's really a loss if it's not picked up. Thank you.
With this, we would wrap up this panel, and please get to the catering. Sorry for prolonging this panel for like 10 minutes.